work here. Jody was talking about one of the really spectacular things about the Morton Village site is the excellent preservation conditions. And this provides for a much better understanding of what animals were present in the vicinity of Emiquon during the 14th century. And this allows for insights on not only the native subsistence, but also the natural habitats. But one of the things we have to remember is that the Native American selection is ultimately responsible for the archaeological faunal assemblages that I'll be talking about and that Autumn will be talking about after me. Okay, gotta get this to advance. There. Okay, during the 2012 excavation season, some of the wall trenches and internal refuse pits that were encountered in the southwest corner of what became defined as structure 25. And here's a picture of this in the field. Now, when this is mapped out, you can see that refuse pit designated feature 224 is unique among the 6 other refuse pits in that it has a very high density of animal remains. And it also had a lot of pottery and other artifacts, unlike the other pit features immediately surrounding it. Maybe as many as 40 pottery vessels represented by pieces of unique rim shirts there. If we look at the feature, once it's excavated and bisected, and you can see a profile here, and we could define distinct refuse fill episodes, and 4 of these are recognized. The 2 radiocarbon dates were taken from zone 2 and 3, and these indicate that the pit was rapidly filled during the mid-1300s. And here we can see with the animal remains, and where the title of my presentation comes from is that there were more than 16,000 animal remains, almost unlike what it shows like in this profile, more bones than soil in some of these excavation areas, especially zone 3. As you can see, 77% of the animal remains from this whole feature came from zone 3. There were no cross mends or refits found across the different zones. And so far as we know, these seem to be distinct episodes, but they followed rapidly in succession. Now, besides the domestic refuse, several special artifacts were found in zone, and mostly these came from zone 3, including a celt, an iron slab, this very unique piece of antler with an embedded beaver incisor in it. And then also we had some small carved deer antler tips and a modified turtle plastron. So all these are unlike the refuse that makes up the bulk of our sample, what we're talking about. Most of what we're talking about here in terms of the animal remains are highly fragmented bones and isolated teeth. These were recovered by screening with 1/4 inch mesh hardware cloth, as well as flotation, which is where we recover very small animal remains and plant remains, and flotation is especially important for plant remains. But we're sure that with the flotation samples that we've got out of this, we're recovering. We're checking on the bias against small-bodied animals. So if we look at identifications, which the identifications were done using the osteological reference collections at the Illinois State Museum, 75% by count of these animal remains were identified to class. Now note that we have unidentified vertebrates making up about 25% of this. And these are really small fragments, and look like maybe pieces of cornflakes if you get these on the table and look at them. And if you take these, quantify this material by weight, it makes up only 4.4% 24% by weight of the entire sample. Something else to note that's kind of unusual, bivalves or freshwater mussels are very rare at the site. We only had 74 very small fragments of shells and 3 valves that could be identified. One of these was a spike or elliptodilidata, and the other was called hickory nut, Obovaria olivaria. So not much in the way of freshwater mussels on this, but you can see from the fish down at the bottom, there's a lot of aquatic resources. Another aspect, we talked about burning with these structures and animal remain refuse. Now, what's kind of unusual with this deposit is that only 1.05% of all of the animal remains show any kind of burning or being calcined from exposure to fire. And I can point out again, fish dominates the assemblage. Now, if we modify this and focus only on specimens that could be identified below the class of fish or mammals or reptiles, we reduce this sample down to 4,800 or 4,800. And amongst these 4,800 fragments, we've got at least 30 animal taxa represented. And there again, presenting in this way, looking at only identifiable material, we've got fish being even more predominant with 18 species at least represented. Various ways to quantify animal remains from archaeological assemblage, and we've got these here. First of all is number of identified specimens, or NISP. That's just the bone counts. And the weights of those that you see green in this graph, that's the specimen weights. We can also look at these to come up with an estimate of what the minimum number of individual animals are represented, and that's shown with the red bars. And then if we take that bone weight, we can use some contrasting ways of looking at that bone weight to look at allometric regression formulas to actually come up with an estimate of biomass. And so this is 4 different ways of quantifying this. And as we go through, we'll emphasize number of identified specimens, minimum number of individuals, and biomass. One of the things I'll note here with this, if you look at the number of identified species of mammals, and look at the blue bar there and contrast that with fish, you can see that fish remains are much more numerous, but by weight, fish bones are, of course, much lighter than mammals. So there's different ways of looking at this data. Now, if we look at mammals, deer is the most abundant, most important mammal represented here, but we do have some diversity. And deer here represents about 13, a minimum of 13 individuals. And wapiti or elk, we have a representation of a minimum of at least 5 individuals there. Elk is surprising and to a lot of people that we had elk here in Illinois. And what's unusual about the Morton Village site is that there's more elk across the site represented than probably any other site that I'm aware of, except for the exception of a site called the Noble Weeding site up in McLean County, which is contemporaneous. It's different cultural groups called Langford. So these 2 sites, for some reason, elk were really abundant during the 14th century. Now, the other category here includes muskrat, cottontail, fox and gray squirrel. We even had a Franklin's ground squirrel bone represented there. And looking at deer skeletal portions to get some perspective on how they were processing these animals, we can look at the quantification of, in the light blue here, this would be what you would expect of a standard deer in terms of the number of specimens. But if we look at what we have with deer, we've got a much greater representation of the lower leg and foot bones. And this is unusual in that we think this probably is a good indication of a lot of processing from marrow, because the metatarsal and metacarpal are the prime marrow producing, the best marrow in a deer. Another thing I also quantified was the elk, and it's a much smaller size, but it's a very similar situation like this with the lower legs and feet. Jody mentioned feasting in this, and this is one of the ideas that a pit like this, that has so much material in it, would be feasting, or may reflect feasting. But one of the things that we've seen from other sites is that feasting usually is indicated by a much higher proportion of the upper forelimb and upper hindlimb bones, which have more of the meat-bearing portions. Also mentioned that we've got 3 flawn bones, a bone from the cranium, a bone from the pelvis, and a bone from the tibia represented here. And those would probably represent late summer kills. Birds are underrepresented. And we've got what's probably most surprising as far as my work here is that the cormorant was really well represented. Minimum of 5 individuals, which is most abundant of all the birds at the site here. There's a minimum of 5 individual ducks, but only 1 Canada goose. Wild turkey is common, but we've also got bald eagle, great blue heron, American coot. Marsh birds seem underrepresented. That would be species such as other smaller herons, bitterns, cranes. And this might reflect human selection or access to marshes. From the eagle remains represented. They came from 2 different zones, and so we're thinking that it's probably 2 different individuals. And they're a rib bone, a distal humerus from the wing, and a quadrate, a bone from the cranium. Turtles we've got here are aquatic, including softshell turtle, but no stink pots or musk turtles, no box turtles, which are the terrestrial turtles. And there's a bar here for pond species, and that's the Emididae, or the fragments of the carapace and plastron that are so small, but they're from that group, that family of pond turtles. Fishes were the big story on the whole pit here. We have over 18 taxa represented. Bowfin make up the vast majority here, and this represents 85 individuals, and that's probably a conservative minimum estimate. Kind of surprising is the abundance of the various sunfishes, and this would include black bass, which would be probably largemouth bass, bluegill, green sunfish, crappie, rock bass, and a lot of small centrarchids, small sunfish, probably different Lepomis species. Catfishes represent all 3 bullhead species, channel catfish, and 1 flathead catfish bones. Suckers are primarily buffalo fish, but we also have some carp sucker, carpoides represented. Gar is interesting in that sometimes expect to find more of these in this kind of habitats, but what we have here is gar represented probably about 67% of the gar remains are isolated scales recovered from the various levels. Also freshwater drum, walleye or sauger, and we even had a bone from stone roller, Catastoma species. We look at attention to the zones. You can see the various sample sizes here. Zone 3 is by far the largest density, and then zone 2 with 960 specimens, that's second. Zone 1 and zone 4 are very sparse in terms of the animal remains. But if you look at the animal classes represented, they seem to be consistent. And if we look at this in terms of the fish, again, we see quite a bit of consistencies here in that bowfin range from 55% in zone 1 to 70% of the fish, identified fish in zone 3. Gar look to be heavily represented, but this is kind of a small sample, 42 bones, and 32 of those, or 76%, are scales. So again, fairly consistent if we look across the site at this. So if we look at the feature as a whole, and the largest single being the largest single deposit at Morton Village, we see the primary greatest contribution in terms of biomass would be from deer, and then secondary sources would come from elk, beaver, and bowfin. And the rest of the animal remains we see here are supplements. So in conclusion, the archaeological provides unique perspective on wildlife and natural resources at Amazon for at least 300 years before the arrival of Europeans. And one of the things we're interested in is attention to additional deposits by Autumn Painter, which will be looking at variations in patterns of faunal acquisition. And by looking at other deposits across the site, is feature 224 truly representative of what's going on there in subsistence, or is there a lot more stories to be told from that? So that's all I've got.